June Nicholas discovered her aunt, Lillian Deo, who was 89 years old, dead on the bedroom floor of her yellow brick house at 1550 Northwest South Avenue in Pompano Beach, Florida, on Saturday, April 29, 1994. Not a single person knew who had beaten, assaulted, and strangled her in broad daylight. This tragic tale would take investigators on an unexpected journey using forensic analysis and DNA evidence, culminating in the revelation of a startling truth that would remain a secret for the next 28 years. With every passing moment, June and the rest of Lillian's family would be enmeshed in a web of sorrow and suffering over the insignificant question: who would want to hurt a harmless 89-year-old woman? The narrative of today transports us back 30 years to the brutal assassination of Lillian Deo in 1994. Today's tale takes place in the charming city of Pompano Beach, Florida, which is located in Broward County. The name Pompano Beach comes from a once abundant species of fish that was found off the coast of the city's beaches, which have azure blue waters and soft golden sand. Presently, Pompano City is a bustling metropolis with an annual violent crime rate of 7.29 per 1,000 inhabitants. However, due to a stagnating economy and population, Pompano Beach had the highest tax rate in the nation in the 1990s. The pace of life was slow, and there were roughly 2,886 violent crime victims for every 100,000 people. In the year 1994, Lillian Deo, then 89, could still enjoy Pompano Beach after a youth well spent, despite the area's high crime rate. In 1905, Lillian Deo was born. Lillian committed her youth to serving others, particularly through her work as a teacher and nurse. All those who knew her cherished her for her kindness, patience, and caring nature, including her neighbors, co-workers, her patients, and students. June Nicholas, Lillian's niece, was among the many people who cherished her. Lillian assisted in raising June, her siblings, and her cousins when they were younger. Lillian moved to Pompano Beach, Florida, to live out her twilight years in peace, with June taking care of her as she grew older and began to experience memory loss due to illnesses related to aging. Lillian Deo, who was 89 years old, was a shining example of a life well lived to everyone who knew her. Lillian retired to her yellow brick home at 1550 Northwest 7th Avenue, Pompano Beach, after years of serving her community as a teacher and nurse. She lived a fairly normal life there by herself until violence broke through the window of her bedroom and disturbed her peace. For Lillian Deo, Saturday, April 29, 1994, was just like any other. Expecting a visit from her niece, June. Later that evening, she relaxed throughout the day in her pink and white checkered nightgown. As Lillian grew older, June took on the role of caregiver, visiting her regularly to see how she was doing and to offer assistance with housework, medication reminders, or just to keep her company. That fateful day, June showed up at Lillian's house at around 6 o'clock to see how she was doing and to drop off some groceries that she had gotten for her. She went into the living room and saw that Lillian was not there. June then yelled out her aunt's name to find out her location, but she got no response. June looked in Lillian's usual sleeping quarters, the first bedroom, but she was nowhere to be found. June followed the hallway and peered into the bedroom on the right. She became a little startled. Her Aunt Lillian was lying on the floor there, appearing to be deceased. June let out a cry and hurried back up the hallway to dial 911. When June's 911 call came in, 2 Pompano Beach Police Department officers responded, their minds buzzing with questions. An 89-year-old woman being killed in her own home was not a story you heard very often. Thus, it appeared to be an odd call. When the officers got to 1550 Northwest 7th Avenue, they were able to confirm Lillian's death. Lillian was found lying on the floor next to a floor lamp that had fallen over and a phone that had its cord pulled out. She was covered in bruises and cuts that suggested she had been beaten. Towels and other clothing items stained with blood were strewn all over the room. In the room where Lillian's body was discovered, the officers also observed a broken window, which is probably where Lillian's attackers had entered. The residence had been pillaged. There had obviously been a violent struggle as Lillian fought for her life, judging by the several broken pieces of furniture scattered throughout the room. The shocking state of Lillian's body gave the impression that it was a crime of passion at first. Lillian's body was covered in contusions. She had fractures to her wrist, nose, and ribs. In addition, there were bruises surrounding her genitalia, indicating that she had been assaulted prior to her demise. She had also been strangled, as evidenced by the bruises on her neck. After Lillian's autopsy, the Broward Medical Examiner's Office determined that she had died from asphyxiation and a blow to the head. The attacker strangled Lillian with a telephone that had the cord pulled out, which was discovered next to her body. But there was no sign that Lillian's assailant had targeted her in particular. So it's likely that the crime was not motivated by passion. Lillian had no enemies because she was generally well-liked in her community. Lieutenant Terrell Fluellen of the Pompano Beach Police Department stated that the overall condition of the house and the crime scene suggested that the case was probably one of a burglary gone wrong. However, that was incomprehensible to Lillian's relatives, who were aware that she had lived alone and had no wealth worthy of losing her life. June remembered that at the time of the incident, Lillian had no more than $50 at the house. A gold wedding band was the only item that seemed missing after the house was searched. The last time the neighbors saw Lillian was when she went to buy a newspaper at around 6:50 a.m. that morning. But police officers interviewed them after gathering evidence from the crime scene to see if they had heard anything connected to Lillian's murder. Despite the fact that the murder happened in broad daylight, she appeared hale and hearty that morning, and nobody could remember seeing anything suspicious. Detectives had compiled a list of passable suspects in Lillian's murder within a few days, but not enough to warrant an arrest. In an effort to encourage witnesses to try and recall anything they may have heard or seen that could aid in the investigation, the police offered a $1,000 reward for information leading to the murderer of Lillian's identification. San Rucking, a spokeswoman for the Pompano Beach Police, also informed the media that the police were searching for anyone with information regarding the crime or the man who committed it. San Rucking stated in an interview with The Sun, "At this point, we are urging anyone who saw anything to call us. With the blood of a defenseless 89-year-old woman in their hands, some sort of human monster is rampant." However, despite the initial weeks of investigation and encouraging progress, all leads quickly dried up, and the case became cold. June Nicholas, meanwhile, was in mourning over the passing of her cherished Aunt Lillian. It was so difficult for her to move on without her aunt, and without knowing what had happened or who had hurt her in such a way. June was affected by her aunt's demise that she had to take a full year off work. She was in too much pain to care for her children for a few months, so she had to ask someone else to watch them while she grieved. No matter how hard she tried, she was unable to shake the picture of Lillian lying motionless on the floor of her home. To make matters worse, the case was abandoned, extinguishing any possibility of learning the truth about Lillian's true fate. Lillian Deo case was shelved and forgotten for the following 10 years, during which time there were no new developments. However, by 1999, Pompano Beach was receiving law enforcement services from the Broward Sheriff's Office. Taking control of every cold case in Pompano Beach was part of this. The 1994 murder of Lillian Deo was one of the cold cases that the detectives from the Broward Sheriff's Office reopened by 2004. The investigation was led by Broward Sheriff's Office Detective David Tisley. They re-examined evidence taken from the crime scene nearly 30 years prior and looked through old case files, DNA databases, with the assistance of other detectives in the unit. The pink and white checkered nightgown Lillian was wearing the day she was killed was one piece of evidence that really stuck out. The nightgown contained bodily fluids from the male attacker, which they found when they sent it to the lab for additional testing. This information was possibly the most important piece of evidence in cracking the case. The police used a fluid sample from the nightgown to create a genetic profile, which they then entered into the FBI's Combined DNA Index System, or CODIS, but they were unable to find a match. Once more, a potentially fruitful lead had vanished and the case was abandoned. To allow Lillian Deo's family to move on and find closure, Detective Tisley was adamant about wrapping up the case. Detective Tisley's perseverance allowed him to revisit the case in 2019 under the Broward Sheriff's Office's recently established cold case unit, even though it took an additional 15 years. According to Jennifer Parker, the criminalist from the Broward Sheriff's Office who was in charge of doing the DNA analysis of the evidence in the case, it didn't seem like anything would come of reopening the Deo's case. However, Tisley thought he could identify the person who left their bodily fluid on Lillian's nightgown because of advances in DNA testing technology. In 2021, the Broward County Crime Lab was able to obtain a more comprehensive DNA profile thanks to this new technology analysis. In order to perform a familial search of its offender database, Detective Tisley and his team requested that the Florida Department of Law Enforcement use the DNA profile. In other words, they compared the DNA profile to the database of individuals who had been arrested and registered as offenders. Using this method, the DNA profile is compared to potential first-order relatives, such as a child, father, or sibling in the database. There was a match found by the search. The crime scene's DNA and the DNA of a known offender in the system were remarkably similar. The perpetrator was identified as the son of the man whose DNA was discovered on Lillian Deo's dress the day she was killed. Johnny Mack Brown was the name of this man. Johnny Mack Brown was 40 years old when Lillian Deo was murdered, having been born in 1954. He was a veteran of the Vietnam War and experienced PTSD. For Johnny, life after the military was not pleasant. He turned to drug use as a coping mechanism for his PTSD, which ultimately led to drug addiction. He struggled to find stable employment for a while due to his addiction and mental health problems. Johnny also ended up on the streets. Johnny was never thought of as a suspect in this case or any other crime when investigators first started looking into Lillian's death. He was completely unnoticed, but when Johnny's DNA profile was matched by the police, it became increasingly clear that Johnny was most likely the person who had attacked Lillian on that fateful day. Additionally, police uncovered some vital information. Although Johnny lived a few miles away from Lillian in the early 1990s and early 1994, detectives were unable to apprehend Johnny for questioning because he had passed away. At the age of 56, he passed away from natural causes in 2010. Johnny was laid to rest in the South Florida National Cemetery in Lake Worth, Florida. In August 2022, the request of the Broward Sheriff's Office detectives to exhume Johnny's remains for analysis was granted by a judge. The detectives collaborated with the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office, the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs, the Palm Beach Medical Examiner's Office, and her forensic anthropologist, who dug up the remains and performed DNA testing on them. In order to obtain the most accurate result possible, the experts tested samples taken from Johnny's body in the Broward Sheriff's Office Crime Lab. Jennifer Parker, the criminalist in charge of the office, compared the results to the pre-existing DNA profile. Parker extracted a sample of Johnny's bone marrow for analysis. The test produced a match between the sample discovered at the crime scene and the known DNA profile. According to the Broward Sheriff's Office, The DNA results indicated that the DNA from the crime scene was 66.8 trillion times more likely to belong to Johnny than to anyone else. With this solid proof, there was no question that Johnny Mac Brown was the murderer in Lillian Deo's case. However, that did not adequately explain Johnny's motive. The most plausible explanation for the entire incident appeared to be the previous assumption that it was just a case of burglary gone wrong. Gregory Toney, the sheriff for Broward County, stated in a press conference that it was probably an opportunity crime. The sheriff said, "He lived close by, only a few houses down. He broke into the house when he fell on hard times, became homeless, and developed a drug habit. He might not have realized she was by herself there. She was 89, though. She appeared to be living alone because everything seemed to have been taken out of the house, and all the drawers were open." The Broward State Attorney's Office was shown all of the evidence that the police had gathered up to this point. After looking over the case, the prosecutors then came to the conclusion that Johnny Mac Brown had something to do with Lillian Deo's death. The matter was resolved. While 28 years may seem like a long time to wait for justice, Sheriff Toney feels that justice is eternal. He continued, "So long as we are responsible for investigating these cases, we are going to continue to push for the necessary manpower and effort to make sure that we can bring closure to so many families who have been waiting for decades, time and time again, in the hope that they get some resolution." The family of Lillian Deo prayed for answers to the enigmatic circumstances surrounding their loved one's death for 28 years. They can now start moving on since they have at last found the answers they were looking for. June Nicholas, who discovered Lillian's frigid corpse years prior, expresses her gratitude to the Broward Sheriff's Office for their commitment and for learning the truth about her aunt's passing. She thinks her aunt can now at last sleep in peace. "I'm sure she can sleep soundly wherever she is. We can move on. We can die peacefully because we are certain that her murder has been solved."
Mildred Methen disappeared on Saturday, April 27, 1985. When someone saw her naked and immobile body on the dirt road at Jupiter's intersection of Old Indian Town Road and 125th Avenue North, they immediately contacted the police. On April 7, 1985, Mildred Methen, a 78-year-old Alzheimer's patient, went out of her Lake Worth Beach, Florida home and got into a stranger's car. Unfortunately, she died as a result of this innocuous outing. She was discovered later that day, 30 miles from her house, bruised and naked on an unpaved dirt road. 11 days after her injuries, she passed away. The killer and assailant of Mildred remained unidentified for almost 40 years until a breakthrough resulted in a conviction in 2023. Lake Worth Beach is a charming city in Florida's east central Palm Beach County. The Lake Worth Lagoon is the source of its name. Situated just 64 miles north of lively Miami, the town has a population of about 42,000. This coastal haven is located east of Palm Springs, north of Lantana, southeast of Lake Clark Shores, and south of West Palm Beach. Lake Worth Beach is a unique hub of culture and creativity within the vast Miami metropolitan area. Vibrant visual arts, experimental music, dance, and theater flourish here. The familiarity of neighbors knowing one another by name is the foundation of the community. The streets are secure, much like a place where open doors indicate trust. But even in the midst of such a pleasant environment, a tragedy struck in 1985, leaving a scar in the otherwise tranquil neighborhood. On February 28, 1907, Mildred Methen was born in Wilmar, Arkansas. Despite being the second of Jess and Margaret Warren's 6 cherished children, tragedy shaped her early years. At the age of 37, Mildred's father passed away from a heart attack when she was just 8 years old. This left widow Margaret, who was devastated, to raise their 6 tiny children by herself. As Mildred approached adulthood, she started a career that would shape much of her life. Her compassion and kindness affected countless lives during her more than 40 years of committed work in the field of psychiatric nursing. When she married Guy Harmon Metheny in her early years, the couple welcomed a precious son named Gary into their family. But life also brought its fair share of heartaches. Mildred's husband passed away in 1958, leaving her a 51-year-old widow. Mildred put in nearly 40 years of unwavering dedication as a psychiatric nurse in a Little Rock mental health facility to make a living. Afterwards, following her husband's passing, Mildred relocated to Palm Beach County, Florida, from her birthplace of Arkansas, seeking solace in the city's welcoming embrace. Mildred's 75-year-old sister, Gladys Nolan, offered her a home and companionship after she had persevered through difficult times in life. In Lake Worth Beach, their residence was situated on the 1300 block of Crestwood Boulevard. A life of service had characterized Mildred's journey. She not only took care of her brother as his mental state deteriorated, but also dealt with her own health problems as she got closer to 70. She started a new chapter in her life at her sister's home in Lake Worth as a result of her illness. The allure of Florida's stunning coasts drew her in, and her son and grandchildren encouraged her to make the courageous decision to move. The adjustment was not without its challenges though. Her judgment was clouded by dementia and the transfer, which placed her in unfamiliar terrain. She was afraid to go outside without a reliable companion. When she and Gladys settled into their new Floridian home, she was excited and full of hope for a visit from her cherished grandchildren. On April 27, 1985, Mildred Methen, a dementia sufferer, disappeared from the tranquil enclave of her Lake Worth, Florida home at approximately 4:30 p.m. Witnesses claimed to have seen her at approximately 3:30 p.m. as she stepped out of her house wearing a shirt over pajamas, totally unaware of the impending catastrophe. An excruciating hour later, the alarm went off and she was officially reported missing. 7 hours after going missing, she was found unconscious, nude, and hurt on a remote dirt road by a bystander, about 20 miles from her last known location. After the bystander informed the police of his discovery, an investigation was sparked right away. Mildred's ordeal was evident on the dirt road, which was now contaminated by her blood-stained dentures and abandoned clothes. Her blood-stained dentures were discovered on the road, and her clothes were all over the place. She had a severe head injury, so they rushed her to Juniper Medical Center, where she was examined by a brain surgeon. The woman appeared to have been struck quite hard because of the heavy bleeding from her head and face. No one saw her being kidnapped, but her neighbors claimed to have seen her walking down the street in her pajamas at around 3:30 p.m. Mildred's injuries, especially the severe blow to her head, caused her to pass away 11 days later. The fact that she had been so viciously attacked broke people's heart. The assault test was carried out by hospital nurses because the way she had been hurt was so horrifying. Everything came together for the detectives to piece together. They collected swabs from the crime scene that contained a combination of the attackers and Mildred Methen's DNA. However, due to the outdated technology at the time, no hits were discovered, and the case was abandoned. For almost 40 years, no one knew who had killed and injured Mildred. All the police had was some DNA that the assailant had left behind, but it was too old for scientists to determine its source. Authorities claimed that the Cold Case Homicide Unit had played a key role in this case's resolution for years. This detective squad focuses on cold case investigations. They used enhanced and novel DNA analysis methods to connect the assault evidence to the attacker. In 2021, the foreign DNA was isolated from Mildred's by a scientist who examined evidence from the Palm Beach County Police Station where this incident took place. They used this DNA to build a profile, which they then submitted into the Florida State Combined DNA Index System. DNA from the assault kit was soon connected to a man named Richard Curtis Lang. According to records, when he had hurt Mildred, he had been 25 years old. However, detectives needed to get a direct sample of his DNA to be sure. This required obtaining a saliva sample from Richard Curtis Lang in order to confirm that it matched the foreign DNA found on the victim. They got a warrant or special permission to do this. Detectives went to Richard Lang's house in Boynton Beach, Florida, on April 22, 2021, and took a sample of his DNA. According to records, Richard Lang, who is currently 62 years old, had been in serious trouble in 2006 and 2012, which made him provide his DNA. This was how his DNA entered the database. Thanks to sophisticated detective work and advanced technology, the identity of Mildred Methen's killer has finally been determined after all these years. Records kept by the state and county indicate that Richard Lang had a history of legal issues. He was found guilty of aggravated assault in both 1983 and 1993, but instead of serving time in prison, he received a probationary sentence. But he didn't stop there. He was discovered with weapons in 2006 and 2012. He did not spend much time in prison for these offenses, even though they were serious ones. Richard Curtis Lang was detained and accused of killing Mildred Methen in April 2021. The trial got underway in early 2023 and Richard Lang was charged with Mildred Methen's assault and murder. A significant trial in a West Palm Beach courtroom revolved around a tiny piece of genetic material. Sperm from Mildred's assault kit had a direct connection to Richard Lang. The scientist who discovered the match testified in court during the trial. Although they were unable to confirm that the DNA they found originated from Lang, they asserted that the likelihood of it coming from him was 27 quadrillion times greater than that of it coming from someone else. Scott Skier, Richard Lang's attorney, argued that the DNA might also have come from Lang's close male cousins. Nevertheless, investigators did not run any DNA matching tests on any of them after classifying Richard Lang as a suspect. Assistant State Attorneys Joe Wilensky and Crochet Mixon disagreed with this argument. Reminding the jurors that no other family member was in Florida in 1985, they referred to it as speculative. In his 20s, Richard Lang left Massachusetts to work as a plumber in Florida. He was 25 years old when he brutally attacked Mildred Methen. Thus, only one thing made sense: Richard Lang was the true offender. Richard Curtis Lang was given a life sentence in prison by Circuit Court Judge Dahlia Weiss in response to the most serious charge of first-degree murder. Lang, who was 63, was found guilty. Lang's family told the judge they would file an appeal after he was found guilty. In court, his lawyer read aloud the letter. They believed the conviction to be at odds with their knowledge of Richard Lang. They claimed that the man in court was not the same person they knew and that the charges against him did not align with who he really was. The letter provided an alternative account of the man who was found guilty in 1985 of causing severe physical harm to Mildred Methen, a 78-year-old woman. Regarded as a devoted uncle, brother, father, and son, Richard Lang lived a respectable life, grounded in his Catholic beliefs. The judge was reminded in a letter by the great-niece of Mildred Methen of the severe pain and agony Mildred had endured prior to her death. Mixon, one of the lawyers, read aloud a letter that Methen's great-niece had written. It ran counter to Richard Lang's appeal for mercy. Mixon pleaded with the judges to remember Mildred Methen's anguish and terror. Judge Weiss concurred that Mildred's death was brutal and horrifying. In addition to the previous life sentence for killing, Mixon also asked for a second life sentence for battery. Judge Weiss agreed to 15 years, despite Scott Skier's request for 9. Mildred Methen's death resulted in Richard Curtis Lang receiving a life sentence. Right now, he's spending the rest of his life behind bars. With all of the details, characters, and events familiar to you, bringing a case to a close may seem simple. It is impossible to overstate the emotional toll and complexity that accompanied such a journey though. For more than 36 years, Gary Methen had been waiting impatiently for a call similar to the one he eventually got. At last, he found out that his elderly mother's terrible death had been attributed to someone. He expressed his feelings by saying, "I'd given up hope." He had experienced years of unpredictability. At the age of 88, he was ecstatic to hear of the arrest.